All right, we're live. Good deal.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. Yeah, be careful what you say. So, thank you so much for all coming back this week. I know you take a week off and you worry about breaking your rhythm and seeing who might come, and so I'm glad that you remembered because we didn't talk about it too much. Last we left our heroes, you'll recall that Cain had just murdered Abel. It had gone very bad. But I wanted to get to one of my very favorite things that I discovered. And actually, if you're going to the men's retreat, Brian, you're going to the men's retreat, aren't you? Anybody else going to Tom? No? Okay. If you're not going to the men's retreat, then this is good because you're going to hear this, and if you're a men's retreat, you'll hear this story twice. But to me, this is one of the most valuable illustrations of the value of learning the culture around the biblical text, bringing so much more out of the biblical text. And so what I'm going to start with is a little bit about sort of the cultural beliefs in the rest of the world, so that when we look at, and I know you're going to think I'm joking, but when we look at the genealogy of Cain, which to me is one of my very favorite now moments in the Old Testament, it's an incredibly powerful, countercultural, prophetic, deep statement that we completely miss because we're just so out of the culture in that world. But I want to introduce you to this fellow. This is an Apkallu. The Apkallu, you'll sometimes see them in museums labeled as genies. They are these sort of demigod creatures. They often have bird heads, fish heads, or human heads. They have wings. They very often have this bucket. I don't know for sure what's in the bucket, but all of them carry a bucket when they're going around. And they've got these pine cones here. And the Apkallus are attendants of the divine, very often messengers of the divine down to human beings. So you will sometimes see them by themselves here. He's attending the tree of life there with his pine cone and his bucket. I still know what's in the bucket. Here's another one, this time with the king. He's dealing with here, giving advice. But what's significant about these Apkallu is the Apkallu were the ones responsible for bringing culture to humanity. So in the rest of the ancient Near Eastern world, there was this belief that the gods provided music, art, metalworking, animal husbandry, living in cities, all the things that make civilization, that the gods give them to the Apkallu provide it to the kings, and then the kings can provide it to an obedient people, provided that, pay your taxes and such. So you want nice things, then you need to worship where the king says to worship, you need to do what the king says to do, and then the gods will provide you with nice things. Okay, so the idea is the gods provide culture to the Apkallu provides it to the kings, and the kings gives it to an obedient populace. So again, you want nice things, do what the gods say, and you can have nice things. And that's what these Apkallu are supposed to do. Now, that is the setting of this next passage I was going to talk about. Because what you might recall, right after Cain kills Abel, Cain immediately builds a city. Now, obviously, we didn't get anywhere figuring out who's living in the city or where Cain's wife came from or any of those questions, because those aren't questions the Bible thought were important enough to ask or answer. So we'll just move on with the questions the Bible wants to deal with. Cain builds a city, and then Cain has a number of children, and they have children. And look what happens here in verse 19. Lamech, one of Cain's offspring, took two wives. The name of one was Ada, the name of the other was Zillah. Ada bore Jabal. He was the ancestor of those who live in tents and have livestock. His brother's name was Jubal. He was the ancestor of those who play the lyre and the pipe. Zillah bore Tubal-Cain, who made all kinds of bronze and iron tools. The sister of Tubal-Cain was Naamah. So what we would probably just scoot on past, what I want you to see is what the Bible is saying here, where the rest of the world says that if you want nice things like culture and music and art and city building, then you need to be nice to the king who will get them from the gods and provide them to you. The Bible comes along and says, no, human beings did that. Human beings created living in tents and taking care of animals and metalworking and music. Human beings are responsible. In other words, it's not a gift from the divine, but in this world, it seems that God has created human beings with this capacity to create. That part of what it means to have the image of God and to bear the image of God is to have a creative impulse that then, in some ways, this world is continuing to create itself. It's not a finished product that's handed down from the gods. So the rest of the ancient Near East, the gods give you the Mona Lisa. In the case of Israel, God says, here's a palette and some paints. What do you got? What can you do with these gifts here? Now you still color in the lines. Now that's what's interesting is in the rest of the ancient Near East, the Apkallu also provided law codes. And that's something the Bible says, yeah, that comes from God. The rules, that the do's and the don'ts, those come from God. So there are some things that come straight from God, but the rest of the stuff, you color inside those, right? Here's the palette, stay on the palette. But what can you do? And how can you create? And what's even more impressive to me than this is not just that part of what it means to have the image of God is to be creative and to live in this world creatively. This is the line of Cain. So that there's even something about this that says to me, even sin does not drown out that imago Dei, that image of God, that capacity to create. Even that image of God was louder than human sin. So that it's actually a calling of all humanity, I think, to creatively live into this callings of God, into this world, with whatever it is you can do. This is you can live creatively in your vocation to do that, to provide this world with music, art, whatever it is that it is. So I get excited about this. I've yet to find anybody else get as excited about this as I do, but I just think this is the coolest thing ever. When you realize that, the Bible is making an incredibly powerful countercultural statement here that we just zip right past because it's a genealogy, right? You miss all the begats. Those can be, I get it, they can be tiresome, I understand that. But here, this one I think is a pretty powerful statement that's being made. So, what thoughts or questions on that you have?
What's the age on it?
The age on this text? It was probably kept alive orally for 700 years before it was written down, would be my guess. So I'm guessing probably mid-second millennia is the oral tradition that then gets put down during exile, which is when everything gets put down, pretty much. Yeah.
It's interesting that they ascribe these skills or culture to individual lines.
Yeah. Individual peoples that created these things. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, not everybody's good at everything. You're good at math. Other people are good at. That's that. I think that's kind of the way.
But my kids are good at things I'm not good at.
There you go.
And
same as Cain was good at city building. The kids did other things.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But this, I think, is some powerful vocational statements. That it's not. We get this tendency, I think, to elevate certain vocations and even. I think Lutheran perspectives were that there was the higher vocations of preaching and missions, and then the rest of us who are just sort of biding our time until the new kingdom. And I think the text is saying, no, whatever those gifts are, you creatively live into those. That you have a responsibility to creatively steward this world. That was the calling back in Genesis, and we're going to see it revisited here in Genesis 9 as well. So.
And if I may, one more observation.
Sure.
Per name, I get no credit for anything there.
No, name does. And then there was also, name. Yeah. Well, it is to be a younger brother. Sometimes you just don't impress people. So, all right. Well, let's go over to Genesis 6 because this is actually, believe it or not, those apkalu, I think, can play a role in our interpretation of what I'm going to consider one of the absolutely weirdest passages of Scripture. It's a tight race for weirdest passage of Scripture, but Genesis 6 has to be in any conversation about the strangest passage of Scripture ever. And those of you who've read your Bible through in a year know exactly which passage I'm going for here. When people begin to multiply on the face of the ground, and I should say real quick, the genealogies that you get, genealogy of Cain, then Seth, and now we get into Genesis 6, not only do those provide some interesting interpretive things, but they also narratively serve a function. They move us forward in time. Whenever you get a genealogy, it sort of leaps you, because you can't do every generation's story. It's going to take forever. So you go through some genealogies, and now we've moved forward when people began to multiply. That's a sort of a narrative use of those genealogies. When people began to multiply on the face of the ground, and the daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that they were fair. They took wives for themselves and all that they chose. Then the Lord said, "My spirit shall not abide in mortals forever, for they are flesh. Their days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward. When the sons of God went to the daughters of humans who bore children to them, these were the heroes that were of old, warriors of renown." Well, there's a lot to unpack there. Couple of shorthands for you, sort of cultural shorthands. This is a very literal translation, and so it's helpful sometimes to remember the idioms that the ancients were using when they talk about this. Whenever you see the phrase sons of God in the Old Testament, B'nai Elohim, that is the shorthand for divine beings. There is no single word for angel in the Old Testament. There is the word messenger, which can either be a human messenger or a divine messenger, and you usually have to figure that one out if you're interpreting it. You can name the kind of angel, cherubim or seraphim, those words exist. But if you just want to talk about a general kind of angel, divine being, without naming the type we're talking about, then you will sometimes get sons of God. I think you see this at the beginning of Job. You see this in Daniel when Nebuchadnezzar looks in the furnace and sees one like the Son of God, like a Son of God. He didn't recognize Jesus. He recognized that there was a divine being in the furnace with them at the same time. I always ask the students, how do you recognize Jesus? I mean, what do he look like? I said, I bet his grandmother had one of those pictures, those up on the wall that everybody's grandmother has. I bet that was it. That's how he knew. It looks just like him. No, it's a divine being that he saw in the furnace there. So the sons of God, this is a term that's talking about divine beings. Another shorthand, numbers. Anytime you're in the Old Testament, you get numbers. They weren't thinking about numbers the way we do in a postmodern 21st century scientific Western cultural idea, where numbers are thought of as the objective truth and that kind of hard facts, if you will. For them, it's like anything else. It can be a shorthand. So whenever you talk about generations, you talk about 40 years. So a generation in the Old Testament is 40 years. So 120, for those of you who are troubled in math, is 3 generations. Okay? So in other words, I'm not pointing any fingers. I know you know who you are. So it's 3 generations at 120 years. So in other words, the biblical text is saying humanity's days are going to be set at becoming a grandparent. That people are going to live to be grandparents. 3 generations is basically the idea. And some people get a little extra, right? I mean, if you're particularly blessed, you get, like Abraham, you get 175 years. So he was a great-great-grandfather. And I guess his 3rd great was expecting, because he went 175. That doesn't quite break into a 40 there. And Sarah gets 127, so she gets a little extra too. So that's just saying 3 generations. So try to avoid thinking too concretely about numbers, particularly when they're suspiciously multiple like that. The 480, 120, 40, those are always suspicious numbers in that. All right, that's the easy part of this passage. Now on to the hard part of this passage. What is going on? I have absolutely no idea. I can tell you that this is one of 2 times that this word occurs in the Old Testament, Nephilim. It occurs here, and it occurs in Numbers, where actually Randall O'Brien read that passage on my installation Sunday, where the unrighteous spies were using the memory of this to scare the Israelites. So I don't know why we're trusting their testimony about who's in the land. They're trying to scare people from going into the land. So really, Nephilim in Hebrew can mean the one who has fallen, or it can mean the one with the long neck. Could go either way on that. That long-necked image is what gives you the King James translation, giants in the land. That's where that phrase is. There were giants in the land. Nephilim. Apparently they had long necks. So I don't know what the historical reality behind this text is. I do know that throughout the ancient Near Eastern other cultures, they did believe the Apkallu had presences after the flood, that there were those divine, semi-divine beings that could have human interactions post the flood. And so what I imagine is happening in some ways is kind of what's happening with the flood, and that is everyone else in the world believes this, so you have to address it somehow. You have to find some way to address these traditions they're familiar with. So what do you do about these semi-divine beings who are having relations? Apparently there was some shared cultural understanding of that. I cannot tell you what the historical reality behind this is, but I can tell you what the literary reality behind this is. I can tell you what the story does in the text, and I'm much better at that than trying to tell you what's going on, because I have no idea what's going on. The literary reality of this is this. The borders between divine and human are starting to break down. That human sinfulness and wickedness is now spreading into the divine beings. The divine beings' sin is starting to spread. In other words, it's setting up the idea that the flood is actually in some ways an act of self-defense for God. That God is under attack. The divine barriers are under attack. And so what's happening here is you're seeing them encroaching upon the divine areas, and God's going to have to do something. God can't continue to contend with this forever. That is a literary understanding of it. Like I said, the historical reality, I really don't know. There's some sort of cultural understanding when this text was put down that I think in some ways has been lost for us. But that's the way I deal with this text. Are there questions? No? Good. No, I'll try. I may say I don't know, but yes, sir.
Well, it looks like the sons of God are the ones who are encroaching on.
They are. But that sinfulness is starting to spread. That the sinfulness that we saw introduced back in Genesis 3.
Might you say that the temptation, that they're allowing temptation
Maybe.
to come in?
Yeah.
Being tempted?
Yeah. The sin is breaking down these borders. Something's got to change. Something's got to happen. So that's what God's going to do.
We're not to the flood yet, right?
Not to the flood. No, this is right before the flood. Yeah. And I think that's important too, because in the other ancient Near Eastern stories, this was happening after the flood. But here it's happening before the flood. So, see, this is one of the problems, and we're going to get into the flood now. This is one of the problems when you're a monotheist and you know that there's a global flood that killed everybody. How do you explain that? You know, our God is a God of grace and patience and steadfastness and genocide, sure, but you know, I mean, so that's kind of an awkward moment. When you're a polytheist, this is a lot easier. When you're a polytheist, you can have the mean God who wants to kill everybody, and then the nice God who comes in and gets everybody out of it, right? And that's what most of the ancient Near Eastern stories did. That you had the mean God who just cannot take people's noise. It's just a problem. And then you have the merciful God who comes in and whispers that they're about to flood, and so you need to build a boat and take some animals with you. And so the Bible is a monotheist book, right? So how do you explain this? So how do you explain the flood? How does this make sense when Yahweh is both the God of grace and the God of judgment at the same time here? Well, it's approached, again, I think, through wickedness. And this comes right after what we just saw at the beginning. The Lord, Yahweh, saw the wickedness of humankind was great in the earth, and every inclination of the thoughts of their hearts was only evil continually. Remember that verse, because that's going to be interesting at the end of this story. The Lord was sorry that he had made humankind on the ground, and it grieved him to his heart. Many translations go a little more literal with that, repented. Nahum is a word that is used there in Hebrew to mean repent, and it is a word that is a kind of repentance that God can do. God is sorry. God is, I mean, I've likened this, I think, to Jeffrey Dahmer's mom when she's talked about her son, that level of regret, that, you know, she loved her son, but the level of suffering that came as a result of him, she was sorry about that, repented of that in many ways. That's where God is. This is not approached with anger. This is not approached with judgment. This is approached with a sense of grief. So the Lord said, I will blot out from the earth the human beings I've created, people together with animals, creeping things, birds of the air, for I am sorry that I made them. But Noah found favor in the sight of the Lord. So God has decided, first he decides he's going to undo creation. But Noah found favor in the eyes. So we have the descendants of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation, walked with God. And Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, who apparently are not particularly righteous. They're not listed as righteous in that story. We won't ask too many questions there. The earth was corrupt in God's sight. The earth was filled with violence. God saw the earth was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted its ways upon the earth. And God said to Noah, I have determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. Now I'm going to destroy them along with the earth. Make yourself an ark of cypress wood, or gopher wood. Make rooms in the ark, cover it inside and out with pitch. This is how you are to make it. The length is 300 cubits, the width 50 cubits, the height 30 cubits. Make a roof for the ark, finish it to a cubit above, put the door in the ark on its side, make it lower, second, and third decks. For my part, I'm going to bring a flood of waters on the earth to destroy from under heaven all the flesh in which is the breath of life. Everything that is on the earth shall die, but I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall come into the ark, you, your sons, your wife, your sons' wives with you, and of every living thing of flesh you shall bring 2 of every kind into the ark to keep them alive with you. They shall be male and female, of the birds according to their kinds, of the animals according to their kinds, creeping things of the ground according to their kinds. 2 of every kind shall come to you to keep them alive, to guard them, to protect them. It's the same word that you get in Genesis 2. Also take with you every kind of food that is eaten and store it up, and it shall serve as food for you and for them. Noah did this, and he did all that God commanded. So I'm sure if you were listening, you can hear a little bit of the undo of creation going on here. The waters that are going to come are the chaos waters, that destructive chaos waters of Genesis 1. The creeping things, the animals after their kind, that's almost a direct echo of what's going on in Genesis chapter 1. Things after their kind. I think that's me making noise. So what we have here is uncreation. Instead of God destroying all of humanity now, God is going to reboot the problem. We're going to see if it's just a software issue. If we reboot this thing, maybe things will be better. We're just going to start creation over again. So we're going to get rid of all these other animals. We're going to start over with you, a righteous person, and see how. So he's not going to completely uncreate, but he's going to start over with 2 of every kind, right? Got 2 of every kind. So we get to the next chapter, and the Lord said to Noah, go into the ark, you and all your household, for I have seen that you alone are righteous before me in your generation. Take with you 7 pairs of clean animals, the male and its mate, and a pair of animals that are not clean, the male and its mate, and 7 pairs of the birds of the air, also male and female, to keep their kind alive on the face of the earth. So 2 by 2, or 7 by 2, and 2 by 2, and 7 by 2. What in the world is going on? Is it 7 or is it 2? This is why people have trouble with math. Passages like this, right? This is the problem we're having here. Couple of problems with this. Clean animals. Says who? What's the difference between a clean and unclean animal? Feel free to participate. Do you know where the clean?
Hooves?
What's that?
Cloven hooves?
Cloven. If you chew cud and have a cloven hoof, you're clean. If you have a cloven hoof and you don't chew your cud, you're not clean. So pigs, for example, not clean. And where are those restrictions found? And those where that's all laid out? Anyone know? It's a book that you tried to read the Bible through in a year and got stuck on. You remember which book that is? Leviticus, yes.
Which means we don't know yet.
Exactly. How in the world does Noah supposed to know when the book of Leviticus is the one that gives us these clean and unclean distinctions? And God hasn't set up the covenant that gives us those clean and unclean distinctions. So what's Noah supposed to do with all of this? Well, this is one of those times, and Barbara alluded to this on the first night we were together, that we got a couple of sources being worked together here. That is probably happening. This is usually attributed to what's known as the priestly source, or P in the alphabet soup that you will sometimes hear. JEDP, where the priests are very concerned with animals that are clean and unclean. And again, do we want to be too mathematical about this? 7 means enough, complete, wholeness, the right amount. Does that mean 7? Does that mean enough? Does that mean, I don't know. But I think we do see that we're seeing a couple of sources being woven together in this story as we go through. One other place that I wanted to point out, in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd of the month, on the 17th day of the month, on that day, all the fountains of the great deep burst forth and the windows of heaven were opened. Remember in Genesis 1, he sealed the waters above from the waters below. All right, he just opened that back up. He just unsealed it. So the chaos waters above have now come back down. This is a literal act of uncreation. Remembering Genesis 1 is happening here. This is a hard reset here. He's completely rebooting all of this. The flood continues, but God remembered Noah and all the wild animals and the domestic animals that were with him in the ark, and God made a wind blow over the earth, and the water subsided. The fountains of the deep and the windows of heaven were closed, so now we've got the waters above again. The rain from the heavens restrained, the waters gradually receded from the earth. At the end of 150 days, the waters abated. At the 7th month, the 17th day of the month, the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. That is plural. It's always Mount Ararat everyone's finding Noah's ark on. But it's a range, so I don't know how they're picking which is which on that. But hey, there's no money in that, so I won't bring it up. The waters continued to abate till the 10th month, and the 10th month, on the first day of the month, the tops of the mountains appeared. And of course, you know that he sends out a dove, and he sends out another dove, and then he sends out a raven, and then he knows that it has, the waters had abated. After the waters have gone down, Noah builds an altar. He built an altar before the Lord, took of every clean animal, so I'm hoping it's the ones he brought 7 of. Otherwise, that explains why we don't have unicorns, I think. It's pretty clear. Because you pick animals from the 2, then you got problems.
I heard the unicorn showed up late.
That's what it was. Yeah. Well, they went to Noah's Park. They were confused. So anyway, the Lord smelled the pleasing odor. The Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of humankind, for the inclination of every human heart is evil from youth. So the reason that he's not going to destroy the earth anymore is exactly the same reason that he was going to destroy the earth in the first place, which I find fascinating. I don't know what that means, but it's funny to me. You know, these people are completely evil. I'm just going to start over. And he said, well, you know what? I'm never going to do that again because these people are just completely evil. Nor will I ever again destroy every living creature as I have done. As long as the earth endures, seed time, harvest, cold, heat, summer, winter, day and night shall not cease. So God makes this promise to not destroy the earth again. And then he gives this blessing. God blessed Noah and his sons and said, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. So the same promise that you get at the end of Genesis 1 is now so this is a true reset. Right? He blessed humankind at the beginning of Genesis 1. Now he blesses humankind here at the end of the floods. Fascinating. It is also the first time ever, every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. Up to this point, everybody's a vegetarian. From here on, meat is on the menu. Now, no blood, because you shall not eat flesh with life. That is, it's blood. So in other words, you can't have blood in the meat. You have to drain the meat. That's what makes it, cut it and get the blood out, and then you can eat it. But meat is on the menu for the first time ever. But we also get this other, for your own lifeblood, I will surely require a reckoning from every animal. I require it from human beings, each one for the animal of another. I require reckoning for a human life. Whoever sheds the blood of a human, by a human shall that person's blood be shed. For in his own image God made humankind, and you be fruitful and multiply, abound on the earth and multiply in it. So capital punishment is introduced as well for the first time here. Something God did not use with Cain, which I think is fascinating, but introduced here. And I think that's another important cultural. We're gonna look at some of the cultural stories here that I think help make some sense of why these things are getting mentioned as we look at it. God says, as for me, I'm establishing my covenant with you and your descendants after you and every living creature with you, the birds, the domestic animals, every animal on the earth with you, as many as came out of the ark. I will establish my covenant with you. Never again shall all flesh be cut off by waters of a flood. Never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. Now, this has been a source of actually some humor to me, that God makes a promise to never again destroy the world with water. Right? Like, he's going to be more creative next time. Is that it? It's like, you know what? I won't use water. Promise. Thank you. I mean, I'm thinking fire. I think that would be a good way to go. No, that's not the point of this story. Remember that I said this is uncreation that is happening in the flood. Right? Genesis 1, this act of creation, the waters are given order to, the chaos waters are divided and given order to. Here, that's undone. God has again shut the doors of heaven, and now he says, not going to destroy this again with water. What he is saying here is, he is not going to uncreate anymore. That there is no danger of worrying about God trying to cut off all humanity again. It's like God is in couples counseling with humanity, all right? God's in a dysfunctional relationship, has been since creation, and they go to counseling together. And God is saying, this is like when that one person says, no, we're going to work this out. Divorce is not an option. I'm in this until the end. That's what God is saying here in Genesis 9. He is saying, look, I'm not going to destroy the earth with fire. I'm not going to uncreate. I'm not going to blot out humankind anymore. I'm in this with you. We're going to get through this, okay? And I'm staying in this relationship with you until the end. That's the promise of Genesis. That's the covenant of Genesis 9. So it's not just, next time God will be more creative in his destruction. That's not it at all. By pointing out the waters, he's actually pointing out that he's in this relationship with one another. We're going to see this till the end. Promise. So we got to figure out how we're going to restore that. That's when we start getting a little bit more into the story. Well, that far, do you have questions or comments? Or yes, ma'am.
About the flood.
Yes.
How does this relate to other, understandable flood stories
Yes.
in the ancient world?
Well, I'm going to show you exactly that in just a minute.
Okay.
So you are anticipating my next part. So don't steal my thunder. All right. I'm teaching this. Yes, sir.
I'm interested in that precise date of when it happened.
Are you? Okay. It was a Thursday, I think. I'm almost sure.
We used a lot of words to describe precise date.
We do?
I mean, the scripture does that. So I'm asking you when that was.
See, I'm trying to think, do I go for funny or do I, no, I'd probably just be, that's another one of those questions the Bible doesn't really care enough to answer, like where Cain's wife came from. Because, and this is the reality of it, and I can use this to
except
segue.
it says it here.
Where?
Well, I mean, it gave the number on the
Yes.
17th day of, whatever.
Well, it doesn't give too much. Wait, I went the wrong way. Too far. You mean back on it gave us the year that it started when he was old, and it gave us the days of how long it lasted. But the waters continued to debate on the 10th month, but that's
Yeah.
No, it's on this chapter 7.
chapter 7. It gives us the
7th month, 17th day.
of,
You just went away from it.
11, verse
So-
11, chapter 7.
I think I may have skipped that part. 9, 10, 11. The dove came.
No, you're in the wrong chapter.
I'm in the wrong chapter. That's 8 or 9, isn't it? Or 8. All right, let's go back. This one?
Right there.
In the 600th year of Noah's life, the 2nd month, on the 17th day of the month. That's when. So if you get Noah's birthday, you got it.
Yeah, I just, it's curious that.
It is.
Whenever this is written, that would have such precision.
Yeah, I think they would think in terms of month and days, but again, I don't think that they were thinking in terms of from the foundation of creation, because they don't date it that way. In that way.
There's no biblical significance to the 17th day or the second month, for example.
Those don't have suspicious numbers to them. It didn't say the 7th day of the 12th month. Those make you, wait a minute,
Right.
those numbers always provoke. But yeah, this one, not so much. I mean, the truth of the matter is, this was a shared cultural understanding. Everybody in the world believed in the flood. There is no attempt by the biblical text to prove anything. Let me get down to this part, yeah. That everyone in the world had a flood, everything in this world, this ancient Near Eastern world, had a flood story. Everybody did. And so you can't tell the story of how the world came to be without dealing with this. I mean, it's got to be addressed somehow. This would be a huge hole in the narrative of, well, how is your God different than Marduk, or from Tiamat, or from Baal, or any of these other ancient Near Eastern gods? How is your God different? And you tell the stories like, yeah, but what about the flood? How did your God play a role in that? And if there's really only one God, then what's up with that? And so the Bible really had to address this issue of how this flood occurred and who this God is in regard to this. So what I've often said, and I think I said it the first week we did this with the Enuma Elish, Genesis 1 through 11, in some ways the whole Bible, but in particular Genesis 1 through 11 is the Old Testament version of, you have heard it said, but I say unto you, right? You've heard this said about creation. You've heard this said about when cities are built and where talent and where culture comes from. You've heard this said about the flood. You've heard this said about the tower. But I say unto you, this is who Yahweh is, and this is the way. So it's a shared cultural understanding. You're going to get these important echoes. And here you go, Barbara. This is the handout I can give you. The Gilgamesh epic and the Atrahasis epic are two flood stories that predate the biblical narrative very early, and they have their different characters. The human hero in Gilgamesh is Utnapishtim, and Atrahasis is Atrahasis. The creator is Ishtar. Ea is the good god. Enlil is the destructive god. In Atrahasis, Ea is the good god, and Enlil is the destructive god, same names. Yahweh Elohim in Genesis is the same thing. In the Atrahasis epic, it's explicit. The Gilgamesh epic, many infer that it's the noise of humanity, that people have gotten so numerous, the gods just can't sleep. And so we got to do something about all these people because they're just keeping folks up, and we just can't do anything about it. And the Bible comes along and goes, no. It wasn't noise that was the problem. It was wickedness that was the problem. They build boats, and the Hebrew uses the word ark. By the way, same word that is used for Moses. Moses is an ark as well as Noah is an ark. I'm assuming Moses was smaller. Well, we're not given the exact dimensions. I'm assuming his was smaller. Gilgamesh dismantles a house, so does Atrahasis. Noah makes his, I would say ex nihilo, but he had that pile of wood there, so not quite. Makes his new. It was special. 120 by 120 cubits. In the Gilgamesh epic, we don't get the dimensions in Atrahasis. Noah's is much bigger. By the way, cubits, if you don't know what a cubit is, it is sort of standardized at about 18 inches, the length from the elbow to the tip of the hand. 18 inches for a standard cubit, 24 for a royal cubit, because kings wouldn't have the same short arms that we mere mortals would. The span, by the way, about 6 inches. So if you see so many cubits and a span, the span is from the bottom of the hand to the tip of the middle finger. So that's a span, and that's a cubit. There are 3 decks versus 6 decks. The whole thing's over in a week in both the early ones. I think some of those wicked or those noisy folks could tread water for that long. I don't know. The time to complete it was 7 days in the Bible too. 7 days for the flood, for the whole flood, 40 days and nights, and then in addition of the rain, and then an additional year while things went back. Different mountains. I thought this was interesting. In the Gilgamesh epic, he releases a dove, a swallow, and a raven, and then in the Bible it's 2 doves and a raven. I don't know why that's interesting. What the difference there is. I don't know what's going on with a swallow for the biblical mind. Obviously, the Bible thought it was important. Oh, we can't put swallow, 2 doves. Sure, yeah. I mean, we wouldn't want a swallow there. Yeah.
That makes me think it's the same story. It's got passed through.
Oh, sure. Well, like I said, everybody's knowing about this flood. Everyone knows about this flood.
Mm-hmm.
So how does your God talk? So this is how the Bible talks about it. Let's see, what else? Oh, yes. Once it's over, in both the 2 other ancient Near East accounts, there's a food offering that is given. that made a sweet odor, and the gods gathered like flies upon the offering. In the Bible, it's a clean, whole burnt offering, the traditional definition of that word, and a sweet odor to God that God then offers a promise for. The god who commemorates this, Ishtar, who's the creator god in both those places. I love that the ancient Near Eastern, the gods promised to never forget. Never forget we did this. Yeah, remember that time we flooded the world? Yeah, well, we did. God promises to never doom the earth and to remember the covenant and never flood it again. This is the best part to me. Coming up. The sign of the remembrance is a lapis lazuli necklace for the other ancient Near Eastern, which is a little rainbowish when you think about it. It's kind of rainbowy, lapis lazuli. And then, of course, you get the rainbow here. The hero gets immortality in the Gilgamesh epic. Here, all of them get dominion over the world, and they get to, again, bless, fill the earth, subdue it. Here's the part that's so great. What are you supposed to do? You get capital punishment here, but in the other ancient Near Eastern, you are allowed to charge an offender with his offense. You do get a legal procedure that you get here, and they promise they're not going to flood the earth. They'll limit population with wild animals, famine, or pestilence, or barrenness, stillbirths, and celibacy. That's the other way they promise to limit the earth. It's like, thanks. Right? I mean, the other ancient Near Eastern gods really are trying to be more creative. We won't flood the earth. We'll send wild animals and pestilence. There. Compromise. That's what that is. And so, God, on the other hand, completely opposite. God says, now go be fruitful and multiply. Right? Fill the earth, subdue it. This is the same promise you get in Genesis 1. Go be fruitful and multiply. The problem is not the number of people here. In fact, God is desiring the world to be filled. That go and be, and remember also in Genesis 1, that be fruitful and multiply, that was something you had to earn from the God. Remember that was something that Marduk offered if you were faithful. Pray to Marduk. Do what he wants, that he makes you fruitful and multiplies you in the land. The Bible comes along and offers that as an act of grace from the very beginning. So that's happening here as well. So questions on that? Again, this is what the rest of the world believes. This is the Bible come along and say, no. This is who Yahweh is in this story. I think that's important. What is also interesting, and maybe some of you even noticed up to this point, in Genesis 1 and 2, you have God who's very close to humanity, walking with humanity in the garden in the cool of the day. Genesis 4, you don't have God walking, but you do have a conversation between Cain and God. And then you come to Genesis 6, and God talks to Noah, but Noah never speaks in this story to God, which I think is significant. God asked Noah to do something, Noah does it. There's never a question, there's never a conversation. We're going to find that when you get to the tower next week, that God's talking to God's self at this point. There's not even anybody left in the earth, it seems, for God to have a conversation with, that humanity seems to be getting further and further away as you track from Genesis 1 to 11 as you go. I'd like to say that Noah never speaks in the story. I'd like to say that. But unfortunately, he does. And what he does is probably also on the list of weirdest passages of Scripture in the entire Bible. In fact, I have a great, I'll tell you about the story in just a second. But after the flood, after the blessing, Noah goes and plants a vineyard. No one ever plants a vineyard for grapes, right? Why do you plant a vineyard? For wine. That's why everyone plants the vineyard. No one wants grapes. So Noah, a man of the soil, was the first to plant a vineyard. He drank some of the wine, became drunk, and lay uncovered in his tent, passed out naked in his tent, basically. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father, looked upon the nakedness of his father, and told his two brothers outside. Then Shem and Japheth took a garment, laid it on both of their shoulders, walked backwards, covered the nakedness of their father. Their faces were turned away. They did not see their father's nakedness. When Noah awoke from his wine, knew what his youngest son had done to him, he said, "Cursed be Canaan, the lowest of slaves shall he be to his brothers." His only speech in the whole thing, by the way. Cursed be Canaan, lowest of slaves shall be to his brother. He also said, "Blessed by the Lord my God be Shem, and let Canaan be his slave. May God make space for Japheth, let him live in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his slave." So, to catch you up on the story, Noah plants a vineyard, passes out naked in his own tent. His son Ham sees him naked, tells his brothers he's naked. His brothers cover him up, so Noah curses his own grandchildren as a result of the sin of Ham. Oh, everybody follow that? Good. What is happening here? Well, a couple of questions we're going to have to get answered before we know what's going on. And that is, what does it mean to gaze upon your father's nakedness? What is the crime of Ham here? And there are a number of possibilities. There are simply that the first is that simply this is an honor shame violation, that they have shamed his father by gazing upon him. And mocking him is the sense, I think, when he tells his brothers. The other possibility is that, and it's been interpreted this way historically, that Ham had sex with his mother, that was gazing upon his father's nakedness, and that's a euphemism for that, or that Ham actually sodomized his father was an act that was going on here. I don't know what it was, but it was an attack of some sort. It was felt as a violation of some sort because Noah knew what his youngest son had done to him. I mean, it's also phrased in Hebrew as an attack, something that has happened. Now, it is possible that this is an honor shame violation that has happened in some way that he would consider an attack. I have no problem interpreting it that way. But why do you curse Canaan? What did his grandson do to deserve that? Well, the problem we've got here is that God has already blessed Ham. He blessed Ham right at the end of that flood. And so you can't undo that. That's been spoken now. That's like signing a contract. Once God has been invoked in a blessing, and in this case, God has offered the blessing, that's it. I mean, there's no takebacks on that. And so the punishment that would have to come, and this would be a punishment against Ham. And by the way, everyone would read it that way. Everyone would read this curse on Canaan as a punishment for Ham. This is, your progeny has now been cursed in this way. And so it also provides an etiology, and if you don't know what etiology is, it's a story that answers a why question. Like, why does it rain? Why do we have seasons? There's always these ancient stories for this. Why is it that the Canaanites have so many problems when you get there? Well, look at the stock they come from, basically. So it's providing that kind of an etiology at this point. But this is the only time he speaks in the whole story, is to curse his grandson. So the great story about this, I was sitting in a restaurant once, we were right after church, we were talking about Noah, and I think Daniel was probably he was about 8 years old. Thomas was about 6, we're sitting there, and we literally just come from church. And so I made some sort of passing reference in code about this story, and of course Daniel was too smart to let me get away with it. And he said, wait, what? What's the story? And I went, well, there's this story after the flood where, and I cleaned it up as best as I could, but I told this story, and Daniel goes, wow, now I know why they don't let us read the Bible in church. And I thought, wow, that's an awfully prescient moment there. He really got that. But yeah, so anyway. So any questions here I can answer? That would limit the number of questions. Now, are you sure I can? Okay, go ahead, Bob. We'll try it.
I'm going to give you a shot. Why do you think the language is so specific about they walk backwards?
So they're not committing the same.
So the crime is being described as like gazing upon, right?
Yeah.
So if you walk backwards, there's no question. They didn't see it, so they're not guilty.
They're not in
of
any way
that.
involved. Yeah. But again, if we're dealing in euphemisms,
maybe that gives them plausible deniability. Well, did you see him? I never saw him naked.
Well, and they're honored for that. They're honored for that, and blessed for that. So they get land, and even Japheth gets to live with Shem, so that's nice. So yeah. By the way, that word in Hebrew is what gives us the word Semitic. It's the descendants of Israel are coming from Shem. So, by the way, really funny joke that's completely wrong, but it's actually kind of funny, about how embarrassing it is to be one of Noah's sons and be a Jew named Ham. It's funny, but we don't have Jewish identity yet. That doesn't come until after Abraham. So it always made me laugh, but it's not it doesn't work. So anyway. What other thoughts you got? Questions, comments? Yes, ma'am.
I'm kind of fascinated, and I've never really thought about it until tonight, that some of you know how much I like human nature and how we keep messing up.
Yeah.
cause it's just who we are.
Yeah.
And it kinda fascinates me that God said that you people are messing up all over the place, I'm gonna
That's
destroy
it.
everything.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm never gonna do that again,
Fishing
but the
people.
first thing that happens, immediately
Yes.
afterwards,
Yes.
is we mess up again.
And from a great, well, yes, absolutely. And there's a friend of mine, Old Testament scholar, taught at Olivet Nazarene, did a wonderful job breaking down an almost chiastic structure. You know what chiasms are? Should I tell you what that is? Okay, chiasm is A, B, C, C, B, A in a story. So you have, you build to something and then you walk back out of it. There's a good one in Isaiah 6, where they, look with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand with their mind. Otherwise, they'll look with their mind, hear with their ears, and see with their eyes, and turn and be healed. So they walk back out as you do it. That's a chiasm. Okay. And he broke it down, Genesis 1 through 9, as a chiastic pattern, and pointed out that both the story of Adam and Eve and the story of Noah end in a failure in the garden. In Noah's case, with the wine, and so he did a really nice job. There's a lot more to it than that, but when he breaks it back down in that it's just a continued story of human failure all the way through, and that we have an opportunity to do well, and God seems to believe that we can do well.
And don't you wonder where he got that idea?
In fact, I taught this class in Genesis, and we were going through this, and I don't know where we were. I don't think we were here. I think we were a little further in, and I kept commenting on the grace that God shows humanity over and over again. One of the students, she's one of my brightest students ever, and she said, "Why? I mean, why does he keep showing grace? What possible reason would God have to continue over and over?" She was really upset at humanity's failures, but more than that, about God's willingness to continue to work with
Wait a
humanity.
second, that's not fair to humanity.
That's what it's not fair to humanity?
That's not fair to
it's not.
humanity.
Grace is never fair.
No, but I mean to only judge humankind by failures.
True.
I mean, it's like watching the news and saying nothing good
Nothing
ever
good
happens
is
in the
happening,
world,
yes.
when we all
Yes.
know good things happen every day, they don't
Right.
make the news.
Right.
I don't think this is any different, or any of the comments we just made in the last.
You don't think
60
human,
seconds.
well, God did say only every thought in their heart is only evil continually.
That's an exaggeration.
Okay.
If we believe that human nature
I do.
always was
And
and
he
is what it
continues
is,
to give
there's good
blessing.
and bad.
Yes, and he continues to give grace in, that's the other thing.
I'm not trying to be critical of God,
No,
I'm
no.
being critical of the.
Please be critical.
I'm being critical of the interpretation of the text here, not of
I
God.
think that it is true that God says only every thought is only evil continually. And I also think it's true that God gives grace after God says that.
But when we're trying to make sense of the flood, the great flood,
Yes.
and we can do the same thing today when we look at the
Widespread
hurricane.
wickedness.
Who knows how many people probably died this afternoon when 140 mile an hour winds hit the coast?
Yeah.
I hope none, but
Right.
tune in tomorrow.
Right.
But it doesn't mean God's evil.
No.
And if we want to make sense of it, we say, well, God looked and he saw the bad things and he
But
said there's nothing
no,
bad going
because
on
we
here,
don't.
so.
That's not the way we interpret nature in this world, right? We actually read the world differently than they read the world. There was no such thing as supernatural and natural distinctions for them. Everything was God, everything, and so you have to find a way to explain everything with regard to God. That was the way
And
they saw the
I
world.
understand, I agree
And
with
so-
you, that's what's
right,
happening in this.
That's what's happening here, right?
Yeah.
But again, I want to be sensitive to the cultural difference in that regard, and I'm not going to read Hurricane Michael the way that the ancient Israelites read
Yeah, I didn't
the
mean to
flood.
draw
I know,
that close
I
a
know.
parallel.
No, I think that's actually I think it's helpful because I think too many Christians read, we remember we have to translate the language, we forget we have to translate the culture. And particularly with many of the Bibles that we read, formal correspondence translations of the Bible like New Revised Standard or New American Standard, English Standard, Holman Christian Standard, these are all formal correspondence and they're trying to be very literal with the text. But when they are literal with the text, the translators are assuming the reader is going to do the work that's going to work through that cultural exchange. If you have a more dynamic equivalence translation, something like the Message, something like the Contemporary English Version, or even the New Living Translation, they try to work a little bit of that cultural translation in, so you don't have to do quite as much work as the reader. But that's a translation philosophy at that point. So yeah.
You mentioned that you believe that God said, what would he say about the sinfulness?
Yeah, the only
in hearts?
evil is only evil continually.
Yeah.
Yeah. right here, where is it? It's above that, right? No, wait. Yeah, there it is. I will never get, because the inclination of the human heart is evil from youth. Yeah.
Now, do you believe that God said that, or do you believe that the writer of this story put those words in God's mouth? Because that's the kind of God he envisioned, or he was thinking, if I were God, this is what I would say.
Yeah, now you're asking, is the Bible revelation or is the Bible response to revelation? The Karl Barth perspective is the Bible is response to revelation. In other words, God moves, and the authors of the text encounter the way in which God moves from their own lenses and write it in that way. I am awfully Barthian about a lot of things. I try to not dismiss these in that way. That would be easy for me. And I'm tempted to do that, particularly with passages of scripture I don't like in the Old Testament. I'm very tempted to do that. But I feel like for me, I still try to interpret it that way. I will try to interpret it through the culture, but I do try to ascribe the comments to the divine. But I try to hear those comments as they would have been heard to them, rather than try to read them historically into my culture. You hear what I'm saying on the difference there? Yeah. But I'm tempted to go the Bart route. Yeah.
It's a different point, and I'm not sure how deep the point is, but it seems that God is telling Noah's generation and beyond not only to be fruitful and multiply again, but to deal with evil. Evil is going to be there. I'm not eliminating it.
I think that's true.
Initially, I'm disappointed with it. I'm upset by it. I'm going to destroy the earth, and I'm going to reset.
Reboot, yeah.
But evil is still there, and you deal with it.
It's a hardware problem. It's not a software issue. Yeah.
And I didn't hear you say that, but that's one of the interpretations I took away.
No, I think that's not a bad reading of that. I really do. Yeah, I think that's a very helpful one. Yes, sir.
I think of sin as anything that separates me from God.
Or each other, yes.
Yeah,
which is the same.
And so when I see this and I see evil, I translate that as sin, which to me means separation. So it doesn't mean evil. Evil is such a strong word for me.
I think, well, the word here, I would guarantee, I haven't looked it up, but I would almost guarantee 99% that word in Hebrew is wrath. And that is a word that we could translate unpleasantness or badness, that without the quality of morality that we think of as sin. I think chaos, working against God's created order, which is going to set you against God, and we can certainly think of it in terms of sin, but not necessarily, I think, sin when we talk about that word evil here. We can't help but read it as having a moral quality.
Yeah.
I think that this is probably a translation being overly literal and doing us a disservice. I think you may be right, and I wish I'd have thought of that earlier.
I feel like it just has to do more with separation from God.
I think that's right.
Which is what God doesn't want us to be separated. And
I think that's right.
That's how I see all
I think
that.
that's right. And we talked a little bit about that when we did Tree of the Knowledge of Good and Evil. I think that could be at work here. So, all right. Well, thank you for your good attention and attendance. We're going to keep going on this ride and look at the tower next week, I think. I think that's what I said. Not next week. Next week, Jennifer Hawks is going to be discussing the article that was published on Beth Eccles in a journal, and I think that's going to be here, and I think that Jennifer's going to lead that conversation, so you want to be here for that. I'll be back in 2 weeks, because tomorrow morning I'm getting on a plane and flying to see my family. So I will be out Sunday, but I will be back the 21st. All right? So blessings upon you and your house. May your tribe increase. And I'll see you in 2 weeks.
Yeah, we have Youth Sunday.
That's right.
Youth Sunday this week.